Right now, one decision made in Tehran is threatening your gas bill, global shipping, and the balance of power across the Middle East. Iran believed escalation would restore fear and respect. Instead, it may have exposed the opposite, that the power it counted on most was already cracking. And that matters to you even if you live thousands of miles away. When a war zone touches the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that moves more than 20% of the world's oil supply, it does not stay a regional problem. It hits shipping costs. It hits fuel prices. It hits inflation. It hits the price of food, flights, deliveries, and the confidence businesses need to hire and invest. If tankers slow down, insurance costs jump. If insurance costs jump, transport gets more expensive. If transport gets more expensive, your everyday life gets more expensive. This is how distant decisions become local pain. And here's the deeper issue. Iran did not just make a military move. It made a strategic bet. Tehran appears to believe that widening the crisis, keeping the strait under pressure, and pushing nuclear brinkmanship would force its enemies to back off. But that bet may turn into a historic miscalculation. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what is happening, why it matters, and what to watch for next. To understand the mistake, we have to start with the illusion that existed before this crisis. For years, Iran built power indirectly. It did not need to fight every battle itself. It built a network. Hezbollah in Lebanon, armed groups in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas in Gaza, the Assad government in Syria. Together, this network gave Tehran reach without always forcing Tehran to take the first punch. Think of it like a chess player who controls the board through pieces spread everywhere. You may not like the strategy, but you understand the logic. If someone strikes you, you can answer from several directions at once. That was the core of Iran's deterrence. Deterrence simply means making the price of attacking you feel too high. But here's the twist that changed everything. According to Reuters, that network has been badly weakened over the past 2 years. The mastermind who once tied much of it together, Qasem Soleimani, was killed in 2020. Since the Gaza war began, Hamas has lost much of its top leadership. Hezbollah took devastating blows in 2024. And Syria, once Iran's main Arab state partner, collapsed as Bashar al-Assad was ousted in late 2024. So ask yourself this. What happens when a country tries to look stronger at the exact moment its ecosystem of power is getting smaller? That is where Iran's mistake begins. Instead of adapting quietly to a weaker position, Tehran appears to have tried to compensate through escalation. The logic was simple and dangerous. If the network is no longer enough to scare your enemies, you raise the stakes directly. You show you can still close key shipping lanes. You show you can still threaten energy markets. You remind the world that your nuclear file is unresolved. You make everyone afraid of what comes next. On paper, that can look smart. In reality, it can backfire fast. Why? Because once you move from shadow influence to direct confrontation, you stop hiding behind ambiguity. Your actual strength gets tested in public. Your enemies see what still works and what no longer does. Your partners see the risks of staying close to you. And neutral states start asking whether you are now a source of instability rather than a balancing force. That shift is not theoretical anymore. Reuters reported on May 13th that Iran's attacks on Gulf states and the wider war have left Tehran more isolated across the region. Isolation is not just a diplomatic word. It means fewer friends, fewer safe channels, fewer markets, fewer escape routes, and less room for error. The chronology matters here because it shows this was not one bad day. It was a chain reaction. Hamas attacks on Israel on October 7, 2023 triggered a massive Israeli response. That war spilled outward. Hezbollah began firing across the Lebanon border in solidarity with Gaza, and Israel answered with months of escalating force. Then came one of the most shocking blows of the entire conflict cycle. According to Reuters, in September 2024, Israel detonated booby-trapped pagers used by Hezbollah operatives, killing and maiming hundreds. That was not just an attack. It was a message. It revealed deep infiltration. It told the region that even one of Iran's strongest partners had been penetrated from the inside. In the weeks that followed, Israeli strikes killed Hezbollah's top leadership, including Hassan Nasrallah. Then Syria, another pillar of Iran's regional strategy, fell apart as Assad fled in December 2024. Without the same level of Iranian and Hezbollah backing, and with Russia distracted by Ukraine, the regime crumbled far faster than many expected. So when the larger Iran war erupted in 2026, Tehran was not entering the fight with its old board position. It was entering after losing several of its most important pieces. But here is what no one should miss. A weakened network does not always produce caution. Sometimes it produces riskier behavior. Leaders who feel the ground slipping under them often double down because backing down looks even more dangerous at home. Iran's leadership had every reason to fear that looking passive would invite more pressure, more strikes, and maybe even unrest inside the country. So Tehran seems to have reached for the tools it still had left. One of those tools was maritime disruption. Another was nuclear ambiguity. Another was the survival instinct of the state itself. Reuters reported that the war beginning on February 28, 2026, rocked the entire Middle East and overturned settled assumptions about regional security. Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz proved effective enough to shake markets and act as a deterrent. But effective is not the same thing as successful. A move can cause pain and still leave you worse off. If you set part of the neighborhood on fire to stop someone from entering your house, you may delay them. You may also make every neighbor turn against you. The energy angle is where this becomes personal for millions of people who do not follow Middle East politics every day. Reuters reported on March 4th that more than 20% of global oil supply moves through the Strait of Hormuz. That single fact explains why financial markets and governments panic when Iran squeezes that waterway. Goldman Sachs raised its average Brent crude forecast for the second quarter of 2026 to $76 a barrel. UBS projected around $80 a barrel in March. ANZ raised its Brent forecast to $90 for the first quarter of 2026. JP Morgan estimated that if the strait remained closed, crude supply losses from Iraq and Kuwait alone could reach up to 4.7 million barrels per day. Those numbers are not just figures on a trading screen. They are warnings. They mean energy becomes harder to move, harder to insure, and more expensive to buy. They mean central banks worry about inflation lasting longer. They mean factories, airlines, trucking firms, and households all feel pressure. So yes, Iran can hurt the world through Hormuz. But here is the strategic question. If your strongest remaining lever is to squeeze global commerce, does that make other countries respect you more, or does it make them more determined to contain you? That brings us to the second part of the mistake. Iran may have confused disruption with leverage. Disruption means you can create chaos. Leverage means you can turn pressure into a deal that improves your position. They are not the same thing. You can spike oil prices and still lose the political argument. You can shut a lane and still encourage your rivals to build routes, alliances, and military plans around you. Reuters described how Gulf states have been forced to rethink security, shipping, and even their entire approach to Iran. The United Arab Emirates has doubled down on ties with the United States and Israel. Saudi Arabia, despite its earlier detente with Iran, is being pushed to reconsider its assumptions. Qatar, with no easy export route around the strait, has suffered its own damage and has to think harder about how exposed it remains. Iraq faces pressure from both Washington and Tehran. Lebanon is scarred again. In other words, Iran's move did not just target adversaries. It scared the wider region into planning around Iran as a long-term risk. That is a strategic own goal. If your attempt to restore deterrence leads your neighborhood to harden against you, what exactly did you gain? Now layer the nuclear issue on top of that, because this is where the danger becomes even more serious. According to Reuters on May 12th, an Iranian parliamentary spokesman warned that if Iran were attacked again, one option would be enrichment to 90% purity. In plain English, that is weapons-grade uranium. Reuters also reported that the fate of around 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% remains unclear. The International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, the UN watchdog that monitors nuclear activity, has said it cannot verify the status of 8 key Iranian nuclear facilities affected by military attacks and cannot confirm the size or location of the stockpile at those sites. The agency described this lack of access as a serious proliferation concern. That phrase sounds cold, but the meaning is simple. The world is losing visibility into material that could matter enormously if Iran ever decided to move closer to a bomb. And that creates the exact kind of uncertainty that makes every side more jumpy, more suspicious, and more likely to overreact. Here is the irony. Reuters reported on May 4th that U.S. intelligence assessments indicate Iran's timeline to build a nuclear weapon remains roughly about a year, broadly unchanged since last summer. That suggests the war and the strikes did not solve the core problem. Why not? Because destroying buildings is not the same as securing material. If the highly enriched uranium still exists and inspectors cannot verify where it is, then the crisis does not disappear. It mutates. It becomes more opaque, more secretive, more unstable. And that may be another major part of Iran's mistake. By moving into a posture of harder defiance, Tehran may believe it is preserving sovereignty. But it is also increasing the chance that rivals conclude time is running out and diplomacy is losing value. In strategy, perception matters almost as much as capability. If the other side thinks you are getting closer to an irreversible threshold, it may act sooner, not later. If you're finding this breakdown useful, subscribe now and turn on notifications. We track these developments in real time, and the next update could change the entire picture. Now let's go deeper into what's really driving this crisis, because the military story is only half of it. The other half is economic survival. Reuters reported on April 30th that weeks of conflict aggravated Iran's already severe economic problems. One analyst cited by Reuters expected a double-digit drop in Iran's GDP this year. The rial, Iran's currency, had already fallen 70% the previous year, and then dropped another 15% over recent days, though it had stabilized through March. Reuters also reported that shipping data from April 13 to 25 showed only around 300,000 barrels of oil per day moved out into the Indian Ocean from more than 1 million barrels per day loaded onto tankers during that period. That gap matters. It tells you oil is loading, but much of it is not cleanly reaching market. In plain language, the system is under strain. Revenue is harder to realize. Cash flow becomes more fragile. Yet Tehran has not immediately collapsed. Banks remained open. Salaries kept going out. Fuel and staple rationing had not hit full panic mode. This is why the crisis is so dangerous. Iran is weak enough to feel cornered, but not weak enough to fold quickly. And that kind of half-stable pressure can produce the most stubborn kind of state behavior. Think of a team in the final minutes of a game, down but not out. That is often when it takes the wildest shots. Reuters quoted analysts saying Iranian leaders appear to have calculated a longer runway than Western policymakers expected. Iran has internal supplies, land trade with neighbors, and experience working around sanctions. It also has something even more important in moments like this, a leadership structure built for endurance rather than popularity. For ordinary Iranians, though, endurance looks very different. Reuters described businesses crushed by high prices, supply chain disruption, and internet blackouts. One grain seller said his sales had fallen by around 40% since the war began. A mechanic said his business had nearly come to a standstill. This is where geopolitical analysis stops being abstract. The resistance economy may help the state survive. It does not stop families from losing purchasing power, work, savings, and hope. And when living standards collapse while leaders escalate abroad, the domestic risk does not vanish. It builds quietly. So why call this the biggest mistake in modern Middle East strategy? Because Iran may have burned through 3 layers of protection at once. First, it exposed how much its proxy network had already deteriorated. Second, it pushed Gulf states and other neighbors to think of Iran less as a difficult rival and more as a permanent structural threat. Third, it turned the nuclear issue from a bargaining chip into a countdown clock. That combination is deadly in strategy. When your allies are weaker, your enemies are more coordinated, and your red lines are less believable. Escalation becomes less useful and more self-destructive. What if Tehran had chosen the opposite path? What if it had spent this period quietly rebuilding influence, calming Gulf fears, and restoring inspection channels while retaining ambiguity? That would not have solved everything, but it could have preserved space. Instead, current trends suggest Iran narrowed its own room to maneuver. It may still survive. It may still impose costs. But survival at a higher level of isolation is not the same as strategic success. And this is where expert language often confuses people, so let's translate it. When analysts say Iran has lost deterrence depth, what they really mean is that Tehran has fewer layers of defense and fewer ways to answer a strike indirectly. When the IAEA says there is a continuity of knowledge problem, what they really mean is the inspectors no longer have a clear chain of visibility over sensitive material. When energy analysts warn of supply disruptions, what they really mean is ships stop moving normally and everyone from governments to grocery stores starts paying for it. Strip away the jargon and the picture is easier to see. Iran is trying to prove it remains too dangerous to corner. But the method it chose may be proving something else instead, that it no longer has the stable regional architecture it once used to make that threat credible. Does that change how you see the crisis? Because it should. This is not just about missiles and headlines. It is about a state trying to compensate for strategic erosion in real time. History gives us a warning here. Powers in decline often make their biggest errors not when they are strongest, but when they sense their strongest days may be behind them. They overextend. They assume fear equals control. They mistake the ability to wound for the ability to win. We have seen versions of this in empires, in regional powers, even in schoolyard politics. The student who feels influence slipping sometimes picks the loudest fight, not because he is certain of victory, but because he hopes shock will restore status. Sometimes that works for a moment. Long term, it usually accelerates the loss. Iran still has assets. It still has missiles, internal resilience, geography, and ideological commitment. No serious analyst should underestimate that. But the broader pattern now points toward a harsher reality. The more Tehran uses disruption as its main argument, the more the region organizes to reduce its ability to disrupt. That is the trap. Every aggressive move may feel necessary in the moment, while making the next move even harder. There is also a moral and human dimension that gets buried under strategic language. Families in Lebanon have already paid an enormous price. Reuters reported that thousands were killed, and a quarter of Lebanon's population was initially driven from their homes. Whole villages in the south remain devastated. Gulf states fear attacks on civilian infrastructure and energy facilities. Iraqi state finances are threatened when exports are blocked. Inside Iran, ordinary people face inflation, shrinking business activity, and fear of new unrest. So when we say this may be a historic mistake, we are not talking about a clean board game between elites. We are talking about decisions that rearrange real lives. A child in southern Lebanon, a shopkeeper in Tehran, a worker in Iraq, an airline passenger in Europe, and a family budgeting for groceries in America can all be touched by the same strategic error. That is how interconnected this story really is. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Iran is acting from strength or from fear that its old strategy is collapsing? Your perspective helps us all understand this faster. While you're thinking about that, consider the next piece of the puzzle, because this is where the future of the crisis will be decided. From here, there are three broad paths, and each one depends on very specific triggers. The first is the most likely path, a long, ugly stalemate. In this scenario, Iran keeps enough pressure on shipping and enough ambiguity around the nuclear file to stay dangerous, but not enough to trigger a full, uncontrollable regional explosion. Israel and the United States keep striking selectively, containing rather than completely resolving the threat. Gulf states harden defenses, diversify routes, and deepen security ties. Iran survives, but with weaker proxies, a bruised economy, and heavier dependence on coercion at home. This is the path of slow damage. No dramatic final battle. Just months of pressure, spikes in energy fear, diplomatic deadlock, and repeated moments when everyone thinks the next round could be bigger. If current trends continue, this is the path policymakers probably expect, because it allows every side to avoid total war while still refusing to back down. The second path is the worst-case scenario, and it becomes more likely if nuclear opacity deepens. If inspectors remain blocked, if rhetoric about 90% enrichment becomes policy, or if intelligence suggests the uranium stockpile is moving beyond visibility, then the pressure for a more decisive military operation rises sharply. This is where miscalculation becomes everything. One side may think it is signaling resolve. The other side may interpret it as a sprint toward a point of no return. The result could be a larger regional war touching Lebanon, Iraq, the Gulf, and key maritime choke points at the same time. Remember, the IAEA has already said it cannot verify the status of major affected facilities and cannot confirm the stockpile picture at those sites. That uncertainty is combustible. In crises like this, uncertainty does not calm people. It pushes them toward worst-case thinking. And worst-case thinking is what starts wars that nobody fully planned. The third path is the wild card, and it may be the most overlooked. Iran could decide that strategic survival now requires tactical retreat. Not surrender. Not capitulation. Just a recalibration. That could mean restoring fuller inspection access, lowering nuclear rhetoric, easing pressure on shipping, and trying to divide its opponents diplomatically instead of uniting them. If Tehran concludes that its real mistake was exposing weakness too publicly, it may try to rebuild through patience rather than confrontation. The challenge is that backing off after going this far can look like weakness internally. Hardliners may resist it. The IRGC, Iran's powerful military political force, may believe pressure remains the only language its enemies understand. But sometimes the smartest move in chess is not the dramatic sacrifice. It is the quiet repositioning that stops the board from collapsing. The question is whether Iran still has the political flexibility to make that kind of move before events outrun everyone. So what should you actually watch in the news this week if you want to know where this is headed? First, watch the Strait of Hormuz. Not just dramatic headlines, but shipping flow, escort operations, and insurance signals. If tanker movement normalizes, that points to managed tension. If disruption intensifies, the economic shock widens. Second, watch the nuclear file. Any move toward restored IAEA access would be a calming sign. Any confirmed shift toward higher enrichment or further inspection blackout would be a major warning. Third, watch regional alignment. Are Gulf states seeking quiet de-escalation or tightening security partnerships even further with Washington and Israel? That tells you whether Iran is rebuilding leverage or deepening isolation. And I would add a fourth signal. Watch the domestic economic mood inside Iran. Currency pressure, trade bottlenecks, and signs of renewed unrest matter, because foreign policy often hardens when leaders feel the ground shaking at home. Here's the bottom line. Iran's biggest mistake may not be that it escalated. States under pressure escalate all the time. The deeper mistake may be that Tehran escalated in a way that revealed how much of its old system of power had already been damaged. It reached for fear because influence was eroding. It reached for disruption because depth was fading. It reached for nuclear ambiguity because its regional network no longer guaranteed the same deterrence it once did. And once those weaknesses are exposed, they are hard to hide again. That is why this moment matters so much. Not because the crisis is simple. It is not. And not because one side controls everything. It does not. It matters because the choices being made now could define the next Middle East order for years. If you found this breakdown valuable, subscribe for the next deep dive. We're already tracking the next development, and it could change everything. Because the real warning tonight is not just that Iran made a dangerous move. It is that in trying to prove it could still control the board, Tehran may have shown the world exactly where the board is breaking.